Ireland found a new leader in the late 19th century, a man called Charles Stewart Parnell, or sometimes as he's called Parnell, which was actually the way he pronounced the name himself. He is known as the uncrowned King of Ireland. And I think maybe to begin with, one of the most significant things about him, or one of the most striking things about him, I think we have to say that look at a photograph of Charles Stewart Parnell, and the thing you will immediately notice is he has a beard. He is one of the great Irish leaders with a beard. And the only reason I'm pointing that out is because they made a movie of the life of Charles Stewart Parnell in 1937 called simply Parnell. He was played by Clark Gable, who was then the world-renowned international sex symbol. And Clark Gable famously refused to have a beard. And so the movie of Parnell has a perfectly clean-shaven Clark Gable. And the movie was a flop. It was one of the only flops in Clark Gable's career. And it began to have people thinking there is a curse surrounding the name of Parnell. And the irony is, Parnell would have agreed with them. Parnell was an intensely superstitious man. He hated the number 13. He would sometimes sit in a third-class train carriage rather than a first-class one because of the way the numbers had worked out. There would be a number 1 beside a 3, and he couldn't allow that. He hated the colour green, and you might think that's a somewhat unfortunate thing for someone who is to become an Irish nationalist leader. But he intensely hated the colour and had an almost physical aversion to it. He hated the month of October, and he always said, I have a great fear that something bad will happen to me in the month of October. And as it turned out, he died in October 1891. And throughout his career, he was plagued by ill health, and this superstitious nature played also an important role. Parnell would sometimes say, how can you expect Ireland to have any good luck when the national colour is green? He is an interesting figure because he was able to straddle the lines between conservative parliamentary nationalism and radical revolutionary activity. He was able to appear to be all things to all men. And his great breakthrough was a new departure in 1879, where he was able to unite the Fenians, the land movement, and the parliamentary movement into one struggle. And it was a struggle that was to propel him to the leadership of the Irish nationalist cause. So he was a clever politician, a skilled politician. He wasn't a particularly good orator. He sometimes was able to give a good speech, especially if it was something that he was particularly passionate about. But at best, he was just precise, methodical, but not incredibly inspiring as a speaker. And sometimes he could be downright dreadful. Sometimes he was just awful. His most famous speech is one that he delivered in Cork on the 21st of January 1885. And the lines from this are inscribed on his statue, which is now at the bottom of O'Connell Street onto Parnell Street in Dublin city centre. And in the speech he said, "We cannot ask the British Constitution for more than the restitution of Grattan's Parliament. But no man has the right to fix the boundary of a nation. No man has the right to say to his country, 'Thus far shalt thou go, and no further.' And we have never attempted to fix the ne plus ultra to the progress of Ireland's nationhood, and we never shall." That is the most famous quote that is attributed to Parnell. It may appear familiar to some people because it is, I'm not going to say plagiarised, it was borrowed from a speech given by Stephen Douglas in 1858 during the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of that year, when Stephen Douglas, speaking about popular sovereignty and slavery, had said that no man could set the boundary to the march of a nation. No man could say, "Thus far and no further." The other thing that Parnell is famous for is his relationship with a married woman, Kitty O'Shea. And you only need to go around the world to see the number of Irish bars that are named Kitty O'Shea after this woman. The first thing that we have to say is that her name wasn't Kitty O'Shea. It was Catherine O'Shea, and Kitty was slang for prostitute. And when this affair was revealed, his enemies called her Kitty O'Shea, to remind people, to make that connection, to denigrate her. And so the name Kitty O'Shea, a term of abuse, has clung to her memory despite all that passing of time. The reality is that everyone knew about this affair. Certainly all the people involved in politics knew about this affair in the 1880s. Her own husband knew, and in fact was quite happy with it. They were separated, and he used this as a way of having an in with Parnell. He used it to force Parnell to get him elected to County Galway as a Member of Parliament. And then once elected, he refused to vote for Home Rule. Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, knew all about it. Mr. O'Shea, Captain Willie O'Shea, Catherine O'Shea's husband, after all, had negotiated a deal with the government on behalf of Parnell. And everyone had talked about how this was the husband of Parnell's mistress who was acting on his behalf. But once it became public, Gladstone made it clear that he would not remain on as leader of the Liberal Party if Parnell remained leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. So there was a certain amount of hypocrisy there, because it was fine once no one knew about it, but then terrible once it became public. The Catholic bishops famously turned against Parnell when this all became public in 1890. And that also created a legacy of bitterness in Ireland, because this is really, I suppose, one of the first instances where the Catholic Church exerted an influence, a dominance on Irish politics. They did not want an adulterer leading their movement. And so many of the Irish people backed them. And that created a big division. And it also created a problem that people said, well, the church shouldn't be getting involved in politics. This really isn't any of their business. And that would, I suppose, be an indication of some of the challenges, some of the debates that would take place in Ireland in the 20th century following the winning of Irish independence. So who was Parnell? Well, he was born in Avondale in County Wicklow on the 27th of June 1846. He died in October 1891, so he was only 45 years old when he died. And he always believed he would die before the age of 48. That was the age his father was when he died, and he said, I will never live that long. And his father was a relatively well-off Wicklow Protestant landlord. So Parnell would have inherited an estate at Avondale, not a huge income, but certainly enough to be comfortable. And he didn't really seem to have any interest in politics as a young man. He went to Cambridge for his education, but there at Cambridge he was suspended for getting into a drunken brawl. And he was suspended for the remaining 2 weeks of the term, but he never returned. He decided he had enough of England, enough of Cambridge, and he came back to his estate, where he spent all his time playing cricket. He had a reputation for being a very aggressive player. And that's all that people knew about Charles Stewart Parnell, a young man who loved playing cricket. His mother was American. She was Delia Tudor Stewart, and she was the daughter of Commodore Charles Stewart, who was an American hero of the War of 1812. He had actually captured 2 British ships off the coast of Spain in 1812. So Parnell was named after this great American hero, and that American influence seems to have been very important for him. And when he emerged as this nationalist leader, people would say, what made him a nationalist? And some pointed to his mother. They said his mother encouraged him in this, and she herself certainly played up on this. She liked to boast that she was a Fenian. She liked to play up about how radical she was. Others said it was his bad experience at Cambridge. That turned him against the English. That made him hate the English and their habits and their customs. Others said that maybe it's because he's only a moderately successful landlord, that has created a certain amount of bitterness and resentment. But for whatever reason, he decided to get involved in politics in 1874. He was High Sheriff for County Wicklow, so he couldn't run for election himself. So he decided to put his brother up for election. And then in 1874, at the end of the year, he decided to run for election in County Dublin. And he gave a speech at the hustings, and it was a flop. It was an absolute disaster. It was terrible. And he lost the election. But the following year, in 1875, he was put up for election in County Meath, and this time he was successful. And so he entered the British House of Commons at a time when it was just getting interesting. Because for the past number of years, there had been an Irish parliamentary party developing. First it was a home government association, then it became a home rule association, under a man called Isaac Butt. Now Isaac Butt had originally been a unionist. He had been opposed to home rule. He had argued against O'Connell. But then the famine had changed everything. He had realised Ireland needed its own parliament, and he became a key figure, and he began to establish a party at Westminster. But some of the people around him, men like Joseph Biggar, who was a former Fenian, they decided to make this group even more radical. Now, Biggar is a very interesting man. He was a hunchback. He was from Belfast and a very strong northern accent. And he decided to embark on a policy of obstructionism. He decided that if the British won't listen to Irish concerns, well, we Irish will make sure that we don't have to listen to British concerns, and we'll make sure that no one can either. So in America, people will be familiar with the concept of the filibuster, the idea of getting up and speaking on your feet for as long as you can until you can't speak anymore. Well, that was something that had never been attempted in the British House of Commons. And now suddenly you had a radical group within Butt's parliamentary organisation trying that, disrupting the working of the British House of Commons. And for Parnell's first day in the House of Commons, he saw Biggar come in carrying 10 blue books from the House of Commons library. And Biggar stood up to speak and began reading from them and delayed the proceedings. And Parnell loved this. And he decided to get involved. And you had times when, for example, in 1877, they were debating the annexation of the Transvaal region in South Africa. And it was only meant to take 1 hour. They were just going to read out the motion, discuss it for a little bit, vote on it, and it would pass. Parnell led the way to ensure that it was a 45-hour continuous debate. It kept going overnight into the next day and kept going, exhausting the British, frustrating them, driving them mad. And that was the great success of Parnell as a leader. That he arrived just at this time when all of this was happening, but he became the key figure. And he began talking to some of the radicals. John Devoy, Michael Davitt, a former Fenian who had been arrested for gun running. He was someone who had lost his arm in a cotton mill accident, working at the age of 14 because children, because of the economic conditions, were forced to work in these factories. Well, he was talking to Davitt because Davitt had become leader of an Irish labour movement, the Land League. And so suddenly you had this wonderful bringing together of the three main strands of Irish nationalism and Irish politics. The land movement, the people who were frustrated at having to pay high rents to absentee landlords, the people who were then evicted, and the memory of all those who were evicted during the famine because they couldn't pay their rents was crucial. Those evictions were still going on in the 1870s and the 1880s. And so you see the beginnings of a land war, with people deciding to not pay the rents. You see the Fenian movement led in the United States, wanting physical force to be used instead. And then you had Parnell offering a victory in Parliament. And so these three separate strands came together for the first time in Irish history in what was known as the New Departure. What it actually meant was that although some land relief, as we'll see, was brought in, that wasn't really the real winner. Although the Fenians got some publicity and support, they didn't achieve their objectives. The real winner was Charles Stewart Parnell himself, because this effectively brought the end to Isaac Butt's leadership. Another man called William Shaw took over, but he only lasted a few months in the job, and in 1880, the Parliamentary Party voted in Parnell as their leader, and for the next decade he would take on the British Parliament and the British Empire in an attempt to finally win home rule for Ireland.